Hey, it's Rachel, and before we jump into today's episode, I want to give you a heads up that we will be covering some tough topics today, including mental health disorders, suicidal ideation, and death by suicide. If you or someone you know is struggling with thoughts of self-harm, please dial 988 for the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. Welcome to Candid Catholic Convos, a program brought to you by the Catholic Diocese of Harrisburg. Our mission is to humanize the Church and help you to grow in your faith, love, and understanding. I'm your host, Rachel Trochet, a cradle Catholic who's only human and struggled with faith on more than one occasion. Each week, you'll hear engaging, down-to-earth interviews and actionable strategies you can implement into your life with ease to help you grow closer to God. If you're ready to open your heart and step fully into the person God created you to be, then you're in the right place. Let's get started. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Candid Catholic Convos. I've talked about my journey with mental health a lot throughout this program, but in case you're new here, hi, I'm Rachel. I'm a cradle Catholic, and I struggle with a mental illness. Throughout my life, I've battled anxiety, depression, obsessive-compulsive disorder, and postpartum depression. I grew up thinking I was alone in my struggles. I didn't even know what I was going through had a name until I read it in a magazine. But as it turns out, over 20% of Americans experience some sort of mental illness every year, according to the National Alliance on Mental Illness. That's more than 50 million of us. I continue to bring it up because I remember how isolating it felt, and I'd hate to know any of you were also feeling so alone when, in truth, 1 in 5 Americans struggle with a mental illness. Even the Pope has diagnosed anxiety. May is Mental Health Awareness Month, and today I'm honored to welcome to the program Deacon Ed Shoener, who is a founding member of the Association of Catholic Mental Health Ministers and the Catholic Institute of Mental Health Ministry at the University of San Diego. He serves on the Council on Mental Illness of the National Catholic Partnership on Disability and has authored several books on suicide. Along with his family and friends, Deacon Ed founded the Katie Foundation after his daughter Kathleen died by suicide in 2016. Her obituary went viral because it spoke to the needs and concerns of people who live with a mental illness. Deacon Ed, thank you so much for joining me on Candid Catholic Convos today. I'm really excited to talk to you about this. I feel like it's not talked about enough. I feel like we're getting to a place where it's more acceptable to talk about it, but it's still a source of isolation for a lot of people. So I really appreciate you taking the time today.
Well, thank you, Rachel. It is great to be here and talk about it and to try to break down the stigma associated with mental health and mental illness, both in the broader society and even within the church. And because Christ wants to be with us in the midst of these struggles, so it's good to talk about it. It's good to let the church do what it can to so we can support each other.
Absolutely. And I understand you're a bit of an authority on this subject. Would you mind telling me a little bit about yourself and kind of what led you to this ministry?
Yeah, I'm authority in the sense that through the School of Hard Knocks. Not some. I don't have an advanced degree or anything like that in mental health care or psychology or anything like that. Like many people, I've become a, quote, authority simply because of having lived with mental illness, both myself and within my family. My most intense, I guess you could say, experience with mental illness is with my daughter, Katie, a beautiful young woman who died by suicide, sadly, in August of 2016 at the age of 29. She was a beautiful young girl. She had what's called bipolar disorder, bipolar type 1, which causes you to go both high on occasion into mania and also the periods of deep, dark depression. In Katie's case, and it's different for everyone, but in Katie's case, her cycle would be periods of long periods of relatively stable behaviors, and occasionally she'd just very suddenly and abruptly become either manic or depressed. And she could be talking like you or I are talking with me, and then 5 minutes later, she fell off the table with depression. It was very unpredictable with Katie as to when these bouts would happen. Our first instance where we knew that Katie was dealing with this mood disorder called bipolar disorder was when she was a teenager in high school. My wife and I went away for a weekend, which is always a precarious thing to do when you got a bunch of teenagers in the house. But we thought we were at the point we had to go away for a weekend for a business trip, and went away and got this call from our local hospital that Katie had attempted suicide. And so we came flying back to Scranton, of course, and tried to wrap our heads around what was going on. And as an aside, I always feel bad when I talk to people, hear the stories of someone who's lost a child to suicide on their first suicide attempt, and it comes right out of the blue with us, with Katie, and you have no idea what's going on or why that happened. Fortunately for us and for Katie, Katie's first attempt did not result in her death. And it took us quite a while, me in particular, to understand what was going on with this mental illness, what this bipolar disorder was. But gradually I came around, started to understand it, because like most people, you have no interaction with the mental health care system until it's right in your face and you have to deal with it. So it took me a while to learn what bipolar disorder is. And Katie always took it very seriously. She took her meds. She went to therapy. She was quite open with her friends about the mental illness and asking them to let us know if she started behaving oddly or different than she normally would. So she got treatment for about 10 years. She was in and out of the hospitals a couple times. But for the most part, she led a good life. She went to Penn State, got a graduate degree in business from Penn State, got a master's degree from Ohio State, and an MBA, and she was one of those exuberant personalities that had tons of friends. And she wasn't the stereotype of what people think of, which is an incorrect stereotype. But so often people think of someone with mental illness as sort of like talking to themselves and being failures and not being able to do anything. And, for most people with mental illnesses, that's not the case. Most people with mental illnesses can live reasonably good lives and have to learn how to manage the illness. And Katie, if you met Katie, you would have never known she had a mental illness. You would have never known she had bipolar disorder. But sadly, on August 3rd, 2016, I'm sure that was very impulsive. She had one of those moments where her depression just took her over the cliff, and she died by suicide. And it was sad, but I will say this, like any other parents who live with a child or a spouse, I guess, if you're not a parent, or someone you love that has a mental illness, this is always in the back of your mind that it could end in suicide. So the day that Katie died, of course, we didn't know it was going to be that day, but the fact that she died by suicide was not a complete surprise to us. So we miss her dearly. And when she died, I thought, full-on dad mode kicked in, and you try to do what you can to still take care of your little girl as best you can. So I wrote this simple obituary that said exactly what happened, because I didn't want any gossiping or discussion, what happened to the deacon's daughter here in Scranton. So I simply wrote this very simple obituary that said Katie had a mental illness. She died by suicide, but that's not who she is. I mean, she's not defined by that. She's much more than her mental illness and her manner of death, and that we need to overcome the stigma and discrimination that's associated with mental illness, and we need to do better. We need to find better ways to treat and manage these illnesses. So much to my amazement, because neither Katie or I are celebrities, this obituary went viral all over the world. We heard from thousands, tens of thousands of people saying that that's true, that all too often people with mental illnesses are seen only as their illness. They're not seen as the beautiful creation of God that they are, with multifaceted personalities and issues and desires like everybody. But they get boxed into just, they're a schizophrenic, or they're bipolar or something like that. They don't see beyond that. So I heard from so many people saying that resonates with them, their experience, and that we need to do better, and particularly within the church. Need to open up the doors of the church and welcome not those people, us. It's all of us. It's not like it's just some sort of small segment of poor souls that have these illnesses. We all deal with these illnesses to one extent or another. And if we're not dealing with it directly ourselves, we know and love someone that is. So we've started this ministry, Association of Catholic Mental Health Ministers, to try to minister in a more deliberate way to people who live with mental illnesses. So that's my story, how I got to this point. I joke it was God's way of hitting a hard-headed guy from Scranton over the head with a 2x4 to get involved with others in this type of ministry and bringing it into the life of the church.
Well, first, let me say that I'm very sorry for your loss. Katie continues to make an impact even now. And I remember reading that obituary. I was in the throes of my own mental health journey, I had just had a baby and was like really, really struggling with postpartum depression. And I remember reading that.
If I could just interrupt you there for a minute, Rachel. Many people don't think that's real, the postpartum depression. They don't see that as a real mental health challenge. And I'm sure you know, and I have since come to know, it's a very real experience for so many women. And it's not just that you're, an overly emotional woman. It's a real illness. And fortunately, the treatment for it's better now. But I'm glad you mentioned that because, people need to realize postpartum depression is a serious illness that needs to be managed.
Absolutely. And like you, I learned a lot about it through the School of Hard Knocks because I did have to do a lot of my own advocacy because at the time it was talked about, but there weren't a whole lot of things we could do. And it was something that I needed to kind of push forward on. And then when you're in the middle of it as well, it feels like you're just walking, like just waiting for that light at the end of the tunnel. But I like that you mentioned that this isn't just for those people. Like we shouldn't classify those with a mental illness as other, because I had read a statistic that 48% of adults will have experienced mental health illness at some point in their life. Sure. And if they haven't dealt with it personally, then they know someone who has, which is astonishing.
Right. Yeah, it's absolutely, people find it astonishing, but in one sense, it makes perfect sense. We all deal with physical illnesses, and these mental illnesses do have for the most part, have some sort of biological, biochemical component to them, neurological component. And sure, we live in a continuum of mental health. It's not like there's a hard line where, okay, you're mentally healthy with no illness, and on the other line, you have an illness. It's a continuum. And many of us live with anxiety and depression, which is like the common cold of mental illness, to the more severe illnesses like severe schizophrenia and other illnesses with psychosis that are very ill. But it's a continuum. And, none of us, no family gets off scot-free in this. And it's unfortunate that there's this stigma and discrimination and misunderstanding that exists. But I'm absolutely convinced that it's something we can talk about now, that there's a crack in the door. Maybe the door hasn't thrown completely wide open, but there's a crack in the door now where we can talk about this. And I'm absolutely convinced the Holy Spirit is sort of taking that little crack in the door and blowing through it and bringing this into the life of the church so we can understand and support each other, because Christ wants to be with us in this. Christ is the greatest psychologist ever. It's not like there's anything new with mental illness. Mental illness has been around, and mental health challenges been around certainly since the days of Christ and well before. And Christ understands our struggles with this and wants to be with us. And one of the primary ways Christ accompanies us is through his church, through you and I, as broken human beings as we can be. I'm presuming you're broken in your own way. I certainly am. But God can work through us to support each other.
Yes. And speaking of support, going back to my own mental health journey for a second, there were a lot of well-intentioned people in my life who, would maybe say things that weren't inherently bad, but also weren't helpful. And one of the ones that stung the most was like, oh, you're not praying enough, or you're surrounded by blessings. What do you really have to be sad about? Like when I had my baby, it was, you have this beautiful little baby and he's a great eat. What do you have to be upset about right now? Which in turn started this cycle of, feeling guilty and then not being able to work through it on my own, or wanting to seek out help because I felt like I was a failure. How is your ministry working to kind of shift that narrative?
Yeah, we talk about it all the time, and I'm sorry you went through that, Rachel. That is a hard experience. And Katie went through that to a certain extent, and we've even gone through it as parents, particularly my wife. It strikes hard because she feels guilty, even though rationally she knows it's not true, emotionally. And I find this true for many women, that they have this notion that, well, you weren't a good mother if your child had a mental illness, if your child died by suicide. Even though, like I said, rationally she knows that's not the case, but there's still that emotional response. And at best, people say things that are not helpful, if not downright harmful. But yeah, we try to do what we can to dispel that stigma and misunderstanding about these mental health. I wish that were true, that if you prayed more, the depression went away, or that we had some sort of special deliverance prayer or exorcism that would make these mental illnesses go away. In fact, it's not uncommon for parents, when they find out their child has a severe illness like schizophrenia or some sort of psychotic disorder, to call the chancery and ask if an exorcist can come out and make it go away. It doesn't work that way. It would be wonderful, but what? So what I can say is that Christ accompanies us in that suffering and in those struggles, just like he does when we have cancer or heart disease or any other illness. He accompanies us with us. And maybe occasionally there's a miracle, but a miracle is, by very definition, extremely rare. So Christ can accompany with us in that suffering, and so often the way Christ accompanies us is through other people within his church. So the more that we can understand these illnesses, not shame people, pray with us that struggle with these illnesses, and pray for us, but don't make it sound like we have this illness because we're not praying enough. God knows I prayed when Katie died and throughout her struggle with mental illness. Myself, Rachel, I deal with depression, and we can get into that. For far too many years, I self-stigmatized myself. I did not want to acknowledge I had depression and didn't get it taken care of because I thought, well, I'm a deacon. I can pray my way out of this. It doesn't work that way. So a big part of this is, like you said, is just educating people, maybe talking about our own experiences with these illnesses to break down the stigma and let the light of Christ shine into our lives with greater understanding and support.
I love that you mentioned feeling like, because of your situation in life, that you had all of the tools and you weren't ready to accept help from an outside source right away, but that you eventually found yourself needing that additional help. I'm the same way, especially with the postpartum depression. I had bouts of anxiety and depression like most of my life, up until like I actually had a name for it. And then, so I knew that postpartum depression was like going to be coming at some point, as soon as, like, when I had a family. So I thought I was ready for it. I thought I could handle it. And when people would say, like, you're not praying enough, I'm like, that's all I'm doing right now because I'm so terrified of this coming. But going back to what you said about not being ready to accept help, I feel like when we're physically ill or we're physically injured, it's a lot easier for us to go see a doctor. Like that makes sense. And it would make sense that you would also need a professional to take care of your mental and spiritual health as well. But why is it sometimes so much harder to get to a psychologist or a psychiatrist? Why do we sometimes struggle with that?
Well, I think it's what the term is used, self-stigmatization. We don't want to admit to ourselves that we have a mental illness because, we swim the same cultural waters that everyone else swims in. So there's this stigma with mental illness. We don't understand what other people are dealing with, and we don't want to admit to ourselves that we have an illness. So for many years, I'll just talk about my particular story. For many years, I struggled with depression and didn't want to acknowledge that I had depression. And who paid the most for that other than me was my wife, because depression, mental illness doesn't affect just the person. And my wife had to put up with me being not only, not wanting to get up and do things around the house or lay around and be, lazy, as it's sometimes called, but also the flip side of depression is anger. You can get pretty grumpy and pretty miserable. The one comedian jokes about depression being anger without enthusiasm. So you can unenthusiastic anger. But I could be pretty tough to live with when I was going through these bouts of depression. And the other thing is it would come in like the fog. I had no control over when it came in. Sort of like the flu, it'd come in and then it'd go away, and no apparent reason why it came in, no apparent reason why it'd go away. And that's how you know it's an illness. It wasn't triggered by anything in particular, at least that I could identify. But so eventually, through my experience with Katie and dealing with so many other people with mental illness, I finally went to a doctor and said, I have this depression, I have these serious bouts of sadness and thoughts of death, maybe not actively suicidal, but certainly wishing I would, it'd be okay with me if God took me tonight, that sort of thing. So I got a little pill. I wouldn't necessarily call it a happy pill, but it certainly takes the edge off it. And, I go around talking at conferences and that, and I'll talk about my experience with depression and self-stigmatization. And inevitably, at least for me, I usually have quite a few men, although occasionally women, come up to me afterwards and say that they have the same sort of thoughts and the same sort of things, and they've never talked to anybody about it, maybe not even their spouse, because they're afraid they would scare their spouse talking about suicide or death like that. And I always try to encourage them to go see a doctor. It's not bad to see a doctor if you're struggling with these. And I tell people, and if any of your listeners remember nothing from this conversation except this, I hope they remember this, is that if you're experiencing suicidal thoughts, more than just a passing thought, but, really thoughts of death and wishing maybe killing yourself, that sort of thing, take that as a sign of, like, if you were having chest pains or, tingling down your elbow, down your arms, you'd go to the doctor and say, what's going on? I got these pains, I got this tingling, or I'm thinking of suicide, I'm thinking of death. What's going on? Can you help me? And try to analyze that. It may be nothing. It may be just be a passing thought or something like that. But it might be something more serious, and to get it taken care of. And there's no shame in going to see your GP and perhaps getting referred to a psychiatrist, a specialist, to get it taken care of. So again, if any of your listeners out there have these thoughts of suicide, and it's much more common than most people realize, very relatively common thoughts, go see a doctor. You wouldn't hesitate to see a doctor if you had some physical symptoms of an illness. And definitely, none of us are made to kill ourselves. God, did not make us to die by suicide, and it goes against every instinct that we have to die by suicide. So go see a doctor and try to get it, managed and live in recovery, as they say, and try to manage these things. Unfortunately, the word cure is not there yet for mental illness. That's not a word you hear very often. Postpartum depression is a little different because it revolves around hormones and that sort of thing after pregnancy. But for most of these mental illnesses, it's something you learn to live with, you learn to manage. I love the word Pope Francis uses. Pope Francis lives with anxiety, and he talks about this quite a bit over the years, his anxiety. And he uses the word, you have to, it's such a Pope Francis phrase, you learn to caress your mental illness. In America, we would say manage it. We have a more technical way of looking at it. He says you learn to caress it. You learn to take care of it. You learn to live with it. It's not going away. So what he talks about his anxiety that manifested itself first way back in the 1970s when he was a Jesuit provincial, as they call it, in Argentina under a dictatorship. And his priests that he was in charge of were, undergoing terrible abuse and kidnapping, all sorts of stuff. And he had anxiety over how to take care of them. So he went to see a psychologist or a psychiatrist at the time in the 70s. And he says he met with her for quite a few months. She gave him a number of good techniques and ways to deal with his anxiety that he still uses to this day. So he's quite willing to talk about his anxiety, how he manages it. He recognizes when it's coming on, and that's not a good time to make decisions. If he sees the anxiety, he'll sort of put major decisions off to the side until he's feeling better and his anxiety's under control. So even the Pope deals with this, and it's good to see that the Pope is willing to talk about his anxiety. It's something that all these illnesses, like any other physical illness, it's important that we accept the fact that we have these illnesses, learn ways to recognize when it's coming on, and have tools available to manage them or caress them, as Pope Francis would put it.
I think that's very validating to hear that, even someone as close to God as the Pope struggles with this. And I love that word caress, because my therapist used to say, it's like, he's like, you got to ride that wave. Sometimes you're going to have highs, sometimes you're going to have lows. Sometimes the sea is calm. Sometimes it's a bit stormy. It's just about being able to ride that wave. And I love that you mentioned that depression isn't always sitting down and crying uncontrollably. Sometimes it's rage. Mine used to show up in the form of rage or being completely unable to do anything. So there's lots of, there's no one size fits all for depression. So if somebody out there listening is concerned that, maybe they're crying too much, or maybe they have no idea where this rage is coming from, that's that tingling down the arm of it's time to go see someone.
And that we can recognize it. And I will say this from the point of view of a man. I like to think I'm, macho in my own way. Many men like to look at that, or machismo if you're Latino. But you can still be your manliness is not diminished by the fact that you have a mental illness.
Oh, absolutely.
that men need to recognize it's okay to go see a doctor. It's not that you're weak or that you're not able to take care of your family or do your job. It's, if anything, it's a sign of strength that you have enough self-confidence that you can go see a mental health care practitioner and take care of your illness. It doesn't make you less of a man because you're doing it. If anything, it makes you more of a man because you're willing to face up to your challenges and take care of them.
Absolutely, I think that's very important to talk about, and especially as men, or even just as members of society. I feel like in the last several decades, we've really attached a sense of worthiness to our productivity, whether, when we think we're only as good as the work we produce, and vice versa, which can sometimes mean that our struggling with mental health issues or overwhelming emotions, like just grief, consequently, we end up not performing our best, which then sends us into that spiral of, I'm not good enough. I can't seem to handle it. What's wrong with me? What should we do when we find ourselves in a situation like that of being consumed by our productivity?
Yeah, we live in a tough culture, don't we, Rachel? I mean, it is a tough culture where we are defined by our productivity or fame or image of a self-constructed image or an image constructed by society. We all made in the image and likeness of God. I know that can sound pretty cliche at times, but it's certainly true. And we need to remember that we're loved and adored by Christ. And in the midst of these illnesses, it's hard to see that. It's hard to see that we are loved and adored by Christ. But I think those are the two things that we need to keep in mind, that we are more than what we produce. But nevertheless, there are tremendous pressures, and I get this, on men and women to produce, because we want lots of things. We want a nice home, we want nice cars, we want our kids to go to good colleges, all of that sort of stuff. So there is tremendous pressure on us to produce, and I don't want to diminish that.
We've unfortunately run out of time, but if you'd like to hear the rest of this episode, you can listen to us anytime on Spotify under Candid Catholic Convos. Or you can download this episode from our website at hbgdiocese.org. Thank you so much for listening. Our goal at the Diocese of Harrisburg is to walk with you on your faith journey. So if this episode resonated with you in any way, the easiest way to show your appreciation is by sharing this program with your network or by leaving a review on your listening platform. You can also support us financially by making a donation online at hbgdiocese.org/DAC and clicking the Make a Donation button. Thanks again, and we'll see you at church on Sunday.